Hi everyone and welcome to the Empowered You podcast. I'm Javi Israel, your host, speaking to you from Sydney, Australia. After October 7, I found myself in uncomfortable situations, not sure how to respond or navigate. That's why I created the Empowered You, first an organization and now a podcast to equip you with the knowledge, skills and tools surrounding Israel and your Jewish identity. In each episode, we'll explore various topics from multiple perspectives so that you can feel informed, empowered, and proud of who you are. Thank you for joining me on this journey.
Before we begin, if you enjoy conversations that strengthen Jewish identity, deepen understanding of Israel, and equip you to navigate today's challenges with confidence, please like, follow, subscribe, and share the Empowered You podcast with others. Today, it was an absolute honor to sit down with Joshua Dabelstein. Josh is the head of Movement Against Antizionism Australia, head of communications at the Online Hate Prevention Institute, and a writer whose work appears across major Australian publications. In this episode, we explored Josh's personal journey, a journey from being a left-wing Jew who did not support Israel to becoming a proud and outspoken advocate for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. This conversation is a little different. Rather than simply discussing ideas and current events, we delve into the personal experiences, questions, and turning points that shaped Josh's worldview. Along the way, we discuss antisemitism, Zionism, Jewish identity, and why Josh believes it is so important for Jews to understand the challenges facing our community today. We also explore his work educating people about anti-Zionism and why he believes it has become one of the most significant issues facing the Jewish world. Whether you're looking to be inspired, challenged, educated, or simply hearing a fascinating personal story, I think you're going to get a lot out of this conversation. So sit back, enjoy, and let's jump into my conversation with Josh. Hello, Josh.
Hello.
It's so amazing to have you here on the Empowered You podcast. I can't wait to get into your story and what you do. But before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? Where were you born and raised, your family background?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I felt so lucky to meet you a couple of weeks ago. And I just, I rarely hit it off with people really quickly. Like I'm quite tentative. I dip a toe in. I'm like, what do I know? What do I don't know? But you made it very, very easy to keep the conversation going. It's just a pleasure to be here. And I've since, then gone and realized, I actually know of this woman. And then I've gone back through your content and been like, I've seen this before. I know I have a parasocial relationship with this person already. So it's really nice to be here. And I mean, I never really know how to answer this question because I'm such a mongrel. Like last night I was at an event and I got it opened with, what's your background? And I was kind of stumped. Like this was supposed to be the kind of slow ball, to get things going. And I was like, I don't know. I have 4 grandparents who I think have different backgrounds of their own. But in a very Australian way, over the last kind of couple of generations, there's an assimilation and we've all become Australian, and it's boiled down to a bunch of grandkids who are all just Australians. So I always just identified as Australian. I didn't actually put too much time into thinking about what I was beyond Australian. But I recall in my first experience of being Jewish or Jewishness was when I was 4 years old. And I know I was 4. I must have been 4 because it was before school care. And I was explaining to my friend Callum, before, it was before primary school, they had like a care drop-in center for the kids whose parents worked full time. And I remember explaining to Callum that my mother had just told me that we're Jewish. And I remember Callum saying, well, what does that mean? And I said, it means we're not supposed to do Christmas. And Callum looked at me like, oh, like, what are you going to do without Christmas? And I was like, I don't know. I don't know. It was this doomsday scenario. And, because my mother, she's talking to a 4-year-old. So her explanation was, so like, how the date the little number in all of your crayon, drawings at school. There's like a little, 97 or 96, that's the year. But the year is actually the year since Christianity became a thing. But there was a whole other thing before that. And we're from that. And so my introduction was through my mother explaining dates. And then, of course, what does it mean? Mum says, well, Jews, like the way that the dates work is different because we've been around for a longer period of time and we have different months and we have different seasons and we're kind of from a different place, but also from everywhere as well. And because not being Christian, the Christmas thing is kind of a bit of a sticking point. And so all I heard in this disambiguation was this kind of like, oh no, what happens now? So there was no like Chabad kind of share the warmth, share the light, there was no joy whatsoever. It was, oh God, what do I do? So that was my introduction to it. But shortly after that, Mum started taking us every now and then to the shul up the road from where I now live again, Newtown Shul. And we went there, when I was in kind of primary school and ended up going to Emmanuel a bit later. And my relationship to the Jewishness was always kind of something that I could take for granted and not have to think about. So it's strange when something is so obviously a part of you, like you don't really think about it, or I didn't really think about it as like a very assimilated, Australian, and as an Australian first. But what I noticed, and I guess what's fundamental to questions about my background, is that my perception of my identity, as it turned out, was different to other people's perception of my identity. So my background is that I'm like a white Australian male who grew up in Ashfield and then Woollahra and then went to university and yada, yada, yada. Other people's perception of me was, that's Joshua David Dabelstein. He's Jewish. And so I didn't really understand that there was a thing there until a lot later. And it presented in a couple of different bits of friction. One was being at the tuck shop line and someone asks you for $1 and you're thinking, I'm 16, like I don't have many dollars. What do I do? If I give them the $1, I get, that's a rich Jew who's got money to throw around. If I don't give them the $1, it's, that's a stingy Jew. This layer of my Jewishness was superimposed on me. And my reaction was to go, oh, come on, I'm not even that Jewish, as opposed to defending my right to be whatever I am. I didn't understand. Do you know what I mean? I was like, well,
I
it's not even
totally
like
know
that.
what you mean, for sure.
Yeah. So that happened. Then I got to a university and it was basically the same stuff. I said my mum was a doctor. And I remember this guy referring to my mother as a Jewish doctor. And I was like, why is that bit relevant? It was always strange, like this kind of expectation. I met a lot of kids from the country and there was this expectation that like I had all this money and that, when I was struggling to make rent or, didn't want to, go another round at the pub because I just didn't have the cash that some of the other kids had, that I was being stingy. Like that no one was ever like, oh, he probably doesn't have money like every other student. It was, oh, he is just being stingy with it because his mum's a Jewish doctor. And I noticed it more and more and more, and I just always did the wrong thing. I always said, oh, come on, guys, I'm not even that Jewish. It took me a long time to go, wait, what? I'm making it worse. So that's my background.
Whoa. I've got a couple questions. Your mom was Jewish. Was your dad Jewish or your dad wasn't Jewish?
No. My dad's his parents originally from Germany and a mixture of Scottish and Irish. So they're from, honestly, I would say their cultural background is Queenslander. Like that actually, I know that's a strange thing to say, but like that actually really sums them up more than anything else. They're Queenslanders, like they taught me how to fish. They took me to the beach a lot. They're very, very Queensland. Yeah, fully.
Yes. Yeah, fully. It's interesting because their last name, Dabelstein, it's not even a Jewish last name then. It's just a German last name. But everyone probably thought, with the Steen part, they already assumed a Jew boy, with the last name like that. Meanwhile, that's not even the case. And then your grandmother.
It's so ironic though.
Oh yeah, I know. Isn't that ironic? It is. And then your grandmother, your mum's mum, if I recall, you mentioned that she was a Holocaust survivor. Tell us a tiny bit about her.
Well, I never know how to use that phrase or how to describe what she is. Again, everything feels like the truth never really caters quite well enough to the categories we've got for things. And so when I hear like phrases like Holocaust survivor, I've heard her been referred to that plenty of times, and it's a difficult one. Like they got out in January 1939, so obviously the Holocaust was well underway. Obviously they were well experiencing the reasons to have to get out, and they narrowly survived. And it's a very like Jewish. I think only Jews would do this, where Jews would be like, well, technically they got out before the official beginning of the war, and so they're not technically a survivor. And I'm sitting here being like, I don't want to accidentally like steal the clout from someone who went to the camps by being the 2 generations onwards from. It's a very strange, nitpicky thing to do, but yeah, for all intents and purposes, she and her 2 parents managed to get out. Most of the rest of the family didn't. And their story's really interesting. When they got here, it was white Australia policy style immigration laws that made it incredibly difficult for anyone else from the family to get out here. And so they did everything they could, and the letters kept coming back and forth until they stopped in the early 40s. And their response was to bury the Jewishness. They were Hungarians, right? So they were very much Hungarian, again, like I am with Australian. They didn't have an October 7 at this point, or hadn't been galvanized around some October 7 moment to kind of go, oh, we're Jews. They were just Hungarians trying to survive who happened to be Jewish. And while I know some part of the family was much more Jewish practicing than other parts of the family, it didn't make a difference how many of them had been baptized when the Holocaust happened. My grandmother's birth certificate, born in 1933, lists her nationality as ISR, short for Israelite, right? So she never had a chance. But when they left, they made it very clear to the world, we're not gonna be Jews. So she was raised as a Hungarian Australian. Her parents buried everything they absolutely could about it. And my grandma, I think, lived in kind of a bit of a split cognition. She has to have known, but at the same time, the trauma makes it difficult to, I think, for us to imagine that you can know things and unknow them at the same time. To keep yourself safe. And so it wasn't until she was my age, or slightly younger than me, her early 30s, that both of her parents had died young, and she went back through boxes of documents and had to see the tangible, physical evidence of her Jewishness. And that's kind of when the lights went on for her, and she actually went and put all of the pieces together and went, okay, we weren't, as I was told, political refugees, or Jewish refugees. My mother's attitude was that, it's terrible what happened to them. And as she said to me when I was a kid, we just can't let the Nazis win. And that's why she took us to shul. My mum just said, look, I wasn't raised with this. It's been removed from our family, but Jews have wandered in the desert far longer and lost what they needed to keep. And you can breathe it back to life, but it takes effort, and it takes, firstly, understanding what you are and who you are. So she took us along to shul. She made sure that we attended high holidays with different family friends, and mum basically gave us what she knew she didn't have, but what she wanted to keep, the lights on in our family. So now it's my generation who have kind of warmed a step further back in, and of course, despite having, stepped back in, it started to galvanize a lot more around October 7. A real feeling of yep, this is where these are automatically my people. I don't need to explain myself. Having spent a few years before October 7 back in and around Jewish spaces, I'm just so grateful that, mum had done what she could, and that, Chabad Malvern, shout outs in Melbourne, and Aliyah Youth Centre in Melbourne had made spaces for people like myself to be able to very easily kind of walk back in.
Yeah. Wow. Before we get into that whole part of your life, growing up, you went through a public school. How did the kids, like, people always say anti-Semitism is a new thing that Australia is experiencing. Now, obviously, it's now a lot more out in the open, and perhaps, as we'll get to, the modern day form of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. But it seems like to me, like, you grew up in regular Australia, Sydney public school, and all those types of comments like at the canteen. Firstly, these kids must have learned these notions from somewhere or someone, their parents. So how do you feel when people say that anti-Semitism is a new thing that's occurred in Australia? Like, it seems like for you, you had anti-Semitism just growing up, going through the public school system.
Yeah, well, look, firstly, like I was at a public school until I was like 10, and then I went to Sydney Grammar after that. And so there were a lot more Jews at Sydney Grammar. It went from being, I think 5 or 6 Jews in my entire primary school. I can actually name, 4 that I can think of, including my sister and myself. And then when I went to grammar, it kind of went, of the 180 something boys, probably 10 to 15 of us, maybe, 20 max. So like a much higher percentage. So I didn't really, I think there's a few different ways to think about it. So firstly, anti-Semitism, as I experienced it as a child, was something I wasn't cognizant of. So let's take a few examples. One would be the kind of interpersonal, which is where, I remember my father saying that, like, even though his parents they're not as we would think of an anti-Semite, like when Larry David meets an anti-Semite, you're an anti-Semite. There's a particular caricature of a person that's an anti-Semite. You wouldn't call my dad's family anti-Semites, but they expressed reservations about him marrying a Jew, right? What's really interesting is that they're really good people, Like, my relationship with my grandfather was probably the strongest familial relationship I've ever had. And so, like, the time I spent with this man out on a fishing boat as a kid, there was not a bone in his body that didn't like me for being a Jewish kid. But within the culture was a small reservation due to probably lack of really just having had experiences with Jews. And of course, what's really unfortunate is that people like that, like working class people from the Blue Mountains and like my grandparents, Queensland, Blue Mountains, they will, I think it's probably different today, but from their generation, they just weren't meeting as many Jews. And so what's really unfortunate is they could meet one Jew, and that Jew could actually be an asshole, because like no one has a monopoly on that. So we've got ours too, like it would be anti-Semitic to suggest we don't have assholes because it would be exceptionalizing us. We do. And that can forever that feeds into the bigotry, right? And the conspiracy and whatever. They're all terrible. I met one, they were awful. If you meet one who's lovely, like, oh, I met a Jew, they were all right, So it's kind of unfair already. It's a rigged system. So on that interpersonal level, good people can perpetuate hate dynamics, right? Then on a systemic level, think about the school. This is a non-denominational public school that offered scripture, Haberfield Public, right? So what do you do in a scripture class? Well, you learn about everything from the last 2,000 years, but really a small 200-year period of it where a guy turned up and said, I'm God. And everyone was like, we love him. Write it all down. And so you learn all about that, but it's kind of divorced from what you are in a sense. And I would say that's systemic, like, is that anti-Semitic? I don't really know, but I can say that it places the Jew as kind of less important, or the Jewish child's connection to what they are as, having been superseded by a New Testament, so to speak. So you learn these things as a kid. You hear, oh, that's strange. Why did my grandparents used to not trust my mum? And, or, why do we do all this Christian stuff at school? And so you learn from a young age that like Jewishness is different and is a subsidiary of normal. And you don't think of it that way. It's just an experience. I'm like a subset. of a type of person. I'm fully Australian or whatever, but I'm like, in my own little category. And then getting into high school, what's really interesting about anti-Semitism at an all-boys high school is, again, I only recall one episode where I detected any malice whatsoever. There was a boy at the back of the class saying, Joshua, Joshua, and I happened to already not get on with this boy. So my Jewishness was being used to get at me, right? But the other things that were born of anti-Semitism, like the stuff at tuck shop lines, or there was a game called the Running of the Jew, right, where everybody would form a big circle and then boys would throw coins into the circle. It was also called the coin game as well. And anyone who ran into the circle to grab the coins could get punched and beaten and whatever. And it was kind of like the Jew is going to run in, And if and when a Jewish boy ever did behave the same way as any other non-Jewish boys, it was like, look, see, it's a Jew. And because we're teenage boys, there was nothing about it that felt malicious. Like, in my mind, I'm around so many boys we all have Jewish friends here. We all know what a Jew is. And so there's a familiarity, even like a fraternity, in someone being able to be anti-Semitic to you. That it's a strange complex where someone can be like, oh, don't be such a Jew about it. And you're like, shut the fuck up, there's nothing. It's hard to explain, but basically it depends on the relationship you have with that person. And so at a boys' private school, the only times it really got me thinking and made me feel a bit disturbed was A, with that kind of guy at the back of the room, and B, when I started thinking about, why am I the only one who has like this full-on anxiety when I'm at the tuck shop line about how I'm presenting to other people. So it's strange that when we imagine what would anti-Semitism be like out there in the world, my experience was that it wasn't people coming and saying you're a filthy Jew. It's baked into an understanding that the Jew is kind of like a subset of the rest of us. And also, if the Jew needs to be catered to, if we're going to now introduce Jewish scripture, which they did do while I was there, it's like an imposition. Like, yeah, of course the Jews would make that happen, or if the Jew was to say, hey, I feel uncomfortable at the tuck shop line, they'd be like, yeah, of course you do. You guys complain about everything, right? Let's make this about the Holocaust. That's the kind of rhetoric. So the Jew learns not to push back because everyone actually is friends with you mostly. Like, on an individual basis, everyone kind of likes you, but they're also primed underneath for a moment where that could turn into animosity because it is held together by a slight conspiracy theory around the way that Jews work together and are actually stingy and, involved in something that doesn't involve the majority. So, and then again, like I've already explained the kind of high school, the university type of stuff, but it never really disturbed me because it was so benign. And I also grew up in a day and age where I'm watching the ways in which like the women around me are starting to say, hey, like you can't do that. And you're like, oh, God. And the more you think about it, the more you're like, oh, I think I'm part of a problem, And then you learn a little bit more about the plight of Indigenous Australians and you're like, wow, like that's really bad, And then someone like, Pauline Hanson emerges and she, emerges on a platform of anti-Asian racism. And you're like, oh, God, like that's pretty unsavory. And so you don't really spend much time thinking about yourself because you're at Sydney Grammar and I look like this, So we have to keep things in perspective as well. We can both say, yes, there's plenty of anti-Semitism, and it actually wasn't as big of a deal in the lived experience of young Jews as many other types of oppression were. So it would be wrong for me to be like, anti-Semitism has always been rampant and terrible, and we've been screaming it from the hills. That's not my experience. It's been around, of course, but the way in which we should understand it today is not to say, look, we told you so, but instead to say, that's how festering conspiratorial noise, which is benign, can manifest into something super dangerous if we don't look at it.
Yeah, and if we don't educate as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Josh, I just want to take a pause here. And you are brilliant. And the way that your way with words and how you describe everything and how you're answering a question, but you're also teaching and educating along the way. And because I feel like also when you grow up in a Jewish environment, like in your little bubble, someone says, "Oh, give me a coin, you Jew," or whatever, like straight away we're like, "Oh, anti-Semite," there's like this extreme because we're in such a bubble. But now when you realize, like, no, actually they're not necessarily an anti-Semite. These are just, I guess, these norms that have been they've been entrenched and become a part of our society, and people don't even know half the time what they're even saying, and they don't even necessarily mean it maliciously. But yet at the same time, what they do say, their words do have consequences, and it does fit into those stereotypes. That's why education is so important, because hopefully when you educate people on what these, tropes and stereotypes mean and how they manifest, hopefully people would understand and be like, oh man, I don't want to feed into that. I actually like Jewish people.
Quickly, sorry to interject, but just to say that, like, they are anti-Semites. The trick isn't trying to work out whether or not they are, but instead the trick is to say good people can be anti-Semites. Like a really good person can be super racist and super sexist, and they can have very little understanding of the way in which what they're doing is actually sexist or racist. So, like, you're exactly right the way that you put it when you're like, we have a huge reaction to it because we know it's really bad. We know it's anti-Semitic. And the thing that I'm really interested in is how the moralization of the word anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, we would think would make it easier to diagnose and treat, but actually there's a thing that no one is allowed to be, then no one can identify as it, which means no one is that, which means there's nothing to treat, while they continue to do the same thing. So we have to be able to say, not to celebrate the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists at all, but to simply say, I fully understand how two grandparents who are from Queensland, who moved to the Blue Mountains, who raised two boys, one of them married a Jew, I can fully understand how they would be a bit like, oh, what's all that about? And also, yes, that makes them anti-Semitic. And yes, your whole soul doesn't become anti-Semitic when you engage in an accidental prejudice, like if I was to accidentally say or do something sexist, do I like become embodied as a sexist wholeheartedly? No. Today I was a sexist. I said a sexist thing, right? Or a racist thing or a homophobic thing. But we have to allow people to understand that, like, this is just stuff that we accidentally do. Like, we all engage in really antisocial ways of perceiving of each other and talking to each other. So yeah, you definitely would have, I'm sure, growing up, experienced a lot of anti-Semitism. And like, it's a really hard one to know, like, okay, so we should call it out because it needs to be called out. But also, like, how do you like call it out without making someone feel like they're evil so much so that we can't reach them? It's a very
Yes,
difficult. Yeah.
it's such a catch-22, and even more, sometimes if you label someone as an anti-Semite, that concept of labeling is disabling in the way of that they might not actually be an anti-Semite, but by you labeling them and calling them an anti-Semite, they actually then become an anti-Semite, and it ends up backfiring sometimes, and we've seen that. So,
Yeah.
it's such it's a difficult conundrum, but at the same time also, if you see an injustice in whatever, whether it's anti-Semitism or any other bigotry or whatever, you got to call it out. But for some, the Jew is always put in these uncomfortable situations, and you really can never win. You're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the reality. So tell me, so you went to Sydney Grammar, you then go to university, and you become a part of what I guess people would call the far left, maybe? Tell us a bit about that journey or your university days.
Yeah, I mean, I got there very much primed for the left. Like, I'd grown up in I think, a self-described left of center household, and I I really believed that there was something more moral about being on the left and something less moral about being on the right. Like the right means that you care about yourself, your individuality, your capacity to express your freedoms, whether or not they impinge on other people's. And the left are people who want to work together collectively to improve the kind of quality of life of everyone. That was my perception of this balance. So any young person is going to go, well, obviously I'm a good person, so I'm going to go on the left. And, I really felt at home on the left. But when you're younger, you've had less time to think about yourself, I guess. You think about yourself all the time, but not from above, You're always kind of like, how are they going to perceive me? What can I do to look like I'm being the right type of person? And so I think a lot of my politics when I got to university was very much based on that, how do I want to be perceived? Because I want to be part of the good fight. And I really believed in I think really important things that I still really believe in, but there was this nasty edge to it. It's this moralization that but I'm actually a better person than people to the right of me. And that's what's so dangerous. That's what we don't tolerate in racism. That's what we don't tolerate in sexism. But in this particular dialogue, it's embraced. I'm a better person. You're a second class. Exactly.
Superior.
Exactly. So once you're on that, it's really kind of all bets are off, the gloves are off. You can kind of do whatever you like. You can justify it. This feeds really neatly into the kind of far left celebration of something like October 7 or excusing for Bondi. It's this kind of well, you got to break a few eggs to make an omelette. Don't you understand struggle? You can kind of justify it because ultimately, as Bob Dylan wrote, ironically, you've got God on your side. You really believe that, I've got the right thing on my side. I'm doing the right thing. So that's where I was at. I lived with Marxists. I became a Marxist. I still have a lot of time for a lot of Marxist thought and writing. I still continue to read it. I still continue to think in that way on a lot of issues. I think that, it's hard to explain because we turn words like left-wing, right-wing, conservative, Marxist into weapons, or we boil them down into absolutes. But actually, a lot of me from that era is still fully who I am. Politically, I'm not that different, but it's my relationship with myself and with other people that has completely changed the way I express those politics. And in turn, the politics have changed a bit. I'm definitely I think smack bang in the center these days. But, when I speak about the time, the years I spent on the far left, that I think a lot of people when they say, I used to be a lefty, but now I've come to my senses. I don't feel that way. I don't feel that way at all. I have immense respect for the leftism that I love, and I am outraged by huge elements of the leftism that I think don't adhere at all to what I would consider left-wing values. And I also feel the same way about many elements on the right. But suffice it to say, during those years, there was kind of things that got folded in with the cause that I didn't really investigate. So because I'm Jewish and I'm on the left and Israel comes up all the time, naturally I would become a reference point for people. Well, Josh is on the left, Josh is a Marxist. Josh, what do you think about Israel? And just like I'd done as a high schooler, instead of saying, why are you asking me this? That's bigotry, leave me alone. Instead of doing it, well, I'm not that Jewish, was, well, I'm not that Israeli. I'm not that Zionist. And it becomes, well, I'm not a Zionist. Well, it becomes, well, of course I'm anti-Zionist. Of course I'm against what they do. When you're really young and you haven't read most of the things that you think you care about, it's so easy to decide that actually there is a pariah state and that the Jews really have created this Zionist entity that is really an American satellite state or puppet that's there to steal Middle Eastern oil for the global north. And it makes so much sense within this kind of conspiratorial way of thinking. It's very difficult to break people out of. But I spent a lot of years in that. And I think today we look at a lot of the kind of as a Jews, like the Jews who become weapons for people on the far left. And I know I get very upset at a lot of them. Like I find groups like the Jewish Council, for example, to be just, I don't have words for that level of, it's not okay. But at the same time, I get it. Like I have a lived experience of being in that, you know, and it's really complicated. It's really complicated. That's why I devote so much energy today to breaking people out of it. But yeah, it's very easy to become an anti-Zionist, for example, because no, you don't have to engage in any classical anti-Semitism whatsoever. You don't consider it racist. You don't consider it against the Jewish faith. This feels like an isolated, small conversation about one particular state that coincidentally is Jewish. And you get offended when someone suggests, are you sure it's not just because they're Jewish? They experience more offense than the Jew experiences when someone's an anti-Zionist.
Can I ask, in uni, did that practically show itself? Did you have to go to protests? Did you have to do anything to prove that you're an anti-Zionist? Where they're like, well, Josh, there's a rally that's happening and, we expect to see you there. Were those expectations put on you?
No. The purity test was simply that if and when Israel came up or anything Jewish came up, I was there to help launder the bigotry. And it was the way I talk about it today. I used to say it's just in the water, but today I think about it more as it's not in the water at all. It actually is the water. You can't not be swallowing anti-Zionism. Like that's the default lens that the entire world considers everything through with regards to the Levant and Israel. So you're automatically sorted that way. And the resistance is to fight anti-Zionism. So when I meet people, I live very close to a university campus, and I find myself regularly interacting with university students, sometimes through the talks with Movement Against Antizionism, sometimes just on a dog walk or at the park, right? And it's really interesting, and I like to talk to people a lot. And it's really interesting that it's actually expected that I'm an anti-Zionist. Like everyone expected me to be an anti-Zionist. And people who don't know anything about me, people who've never met me, I'll run into people in this area and they're like, well, obviously he's one of the good Jews, right? Because he lives around here and he's not covered in Magen David and, gold or whatever it is they think that Jews are supposed to be looking like. And so I get automatically sorted, which is really helpful because it means that I get to be in places and conversations and situations where no one else gets to go. Like I get to sit and some of the conversations that I have overheard or been a part of just to see what happens. Like you would not, I'll play you after the recording if you like. I've just the stuff in my local area, the things that people say to me because they're like, oh, thank God I found a safe Jew that I can explain Israel to. It's remarkable. So that's what it was like at uni. I'm on campus and I'm like, yeah, this is how I vote. And this is, the amount that I drink, and this is how much weed I smoke, and this is the Radiohead I listen to, and I've got all of the things checked for cool young undergraduate student, So obviously it just follows that I'm going to hate Israel. It was just there. I don't recall ever, even today, I've got friends who work on university campus, and if I go in for a coffee, and say hello, as soon as we're talking about anything to do with this, we talk in hushed tones. All of a sudden I notice they'll say Jewishism, and it that's crazy. That's crazy. But I don't recall ever having had to think about that stuff, 10 years ago. I just don't remember having ever met anyone who didn't feel the same way as me about this,
Were there any other Jewish, kids that were in the same predicament as you? or were you the only Jew that you knew of with your left, wing kind of crew?
There was one other that I remember, one other Jewish person that I knew at ANU, and I'd actually known her in Sydney, and we ended up at the same living in the same accommodation, but we never discussed this. And of course now, we're still friends, now we talk about it, but we didn't have to talk about it, like it wasn't as big a thing. It just was the water,
It was the
you
water.
didn't need to think about it. And it still is. It didn't need discussion because, for me, it didn't need discussion because I wasn't being stigmatized because I was drinking the water. And that tiny, tiny percentage of Jews today who don't feel stigmatized because they're drinking the water are acting the way I was 10 years ago. It's not a big deal because you're actually wrong and I'm superior, you know? So yeah, I think there wasn't really any space for being Jewish beyond when it was useful to other people. And look, this is kind of sick, but I reckon I felt like I always wanted to be like the slightly smarter, slightly better version of everything. Like, if I'm a white person, well, I'm one of the white people who is like anti-racist. And if I'm a man, well, I'm one of the men who's a feminist. And if I'm one of the Jews, well, I'm one of the Jews who's an anti-Zionist. And it all fits in with the same thing.
It sounds honestly to be so bloody exhausting. So exhausting. And you know what? I mean, we all want to try and be a moral, upright, just person, 100%, and do not stand idly by the blood of your brother. Lo ta'amad dam re'echa, and v'ahavta l're'echa kamocha, love thy neighbor as thyself. These are all fundamentals to being a Jew. And this is what we would hope Jewish people and the world uphold. But oh my God, like we also are human beings, and we make mistakes. And there are sometimes comments that I say where I'm like, oh man, I shouldn't have said that, or I didn't mean it to sound the way it sounded. But I know we were talking about labeling, but I'm not sexist. I don't like to call myself a feminist because there are things that, that I don't, but I believe that women should be treated equally to men. And I believe that we need to treat everyone equally and give everyone the same opportunity. It doesn't matter the nationality, religion, background, ethnicity, etc. But to have to live up to these expectations, and you always have to be a feminist, and you always have to make sure that everything you're saying is politically correct. And then the political scene is also constantly evolving and changing. The LGBTQ plus world, and I'm pro it, but like there are times I can't keep up with all the terms even, and then what's politically acceptable to say, and then what's not. Anyway, sorry, this is me having a bit of a rant. Basically, it's exhausting beyond. So what was then the turning point or the moment where you realized, all right, this is not really resonating with me anymore, or this doesn't feel right?
My answer to that is so like underwhelming. I think it's really underwhelming because there was no finding God moment, no white light experience. It was a really slow grind where my material circumstances and my psychological circumstances, my emotional well-being were just getting worse and worse and worse, but it was slow. Like, when I turned 18, I moved out and I was just kind of like, well, I can just drink and do drugs every day and no one can stop me. And that makes me feel so much better. And so I did it and it worked. Like it really worked, and it just didn't work in a way that allowed me to have a normal life. It made me feel better, but it got in the way of like working and studying and maintaining relationships and maintaining my mental health and my physical health. And so once that kind of attitude starts to set in, it's very hard to shake. So my late teens and a lot of my 20s were very much just kind of a consistent lowering of the bar, where I just, as long as I could sell myself as a really good moral person, I could then exit the systems of the world based on what I thought was a moral confrontation. Like, well, I'm not going to finish that degree because the university system is a sham, and I'm not going to pay for these groceries because capitalism is, undermining morality all over the world, or exploiting everything and everybody, or I'm not going to wear shoes today because I shouldn't have to put shoes on and it starts to get more and more, this ideology of resisting everything is actually like, I believed that it was a resistance to everything that was wrong in the world, but actually it was kind of a resistance to ever looking in a mirror. As long as I imagined what other people were looking at and dreamed up this fantasy of what I thought they could see if only I performed perfectly. And it's so impossible to be perfect that I just sliced more and more of myself away until there was nothing left. And so, I moved interstate a bunch of times. I went from having plenty of friends to having very few friends. And there came a point, when I was about 26, where I had this realization, I guess, that like, this is really bad now. Like, why am I living in this other state? Why am I waking up like in my own urine all of the time? Why am I in trouble with the police? Like, I'm not stupid. I went to a good school, and somehow I just lowered the bar and lowered the bar and lowered the bar and isolated myself. And yeah, I just, I could not stop in the cycle of the drinking and the drug use and all of the rest. It becomes what you are. So yeah, I walked past BWS for the first time since I'd moved to Richmond in Melbourne, and I walked into a GP's office, and I just said, I don't know what to do, but every night I go to sleep and I like promise myself it's not going to be the same tomorrow, and it is, and I can't do it. And he just listened to me for like an hour and then said, you actually need to be in a hospital. Like, you're really, really unwell, and I don't think I really want to let you go. And so he gave me what I needed to go into a hospital. And really, I went in and I was given this opportunity to spend a couple of months to basically be medically weaned off drugs and alcohol at 27 years old at this point. And I just had this tiny room with a mirror, and there was nothing. We weren't allowed a phone. I wasn't allowed a computer. I wasn't allowed a book. I brought in books. They took my books. They were like, you need to just live with yourself. Like, just actually look at yourself. And so, yeah, 2 months-ish, something like that, this is 2018, with just a mirror. And it completely, as everything left my system, I got really sick. You get really sick when you're withdrawing. So I lost a lot of weight, and I was very, very ill and in a lot of pain. But as I came out of it, I was like, I can never, ever do that again. Like, I don't think I can withdraw again. So I don't think I can touch any substance ever again. And then I remember I left this hospital, and I started going to 12-step recovery, and it was all about finding, a spirituality. And all these Christians kept telling me, go to synagogue, like go to shul. And I finally did it. And just having had that experience with this mirror and being like, I cannot believe that I hadn't actually looked at myself properly for so long. I'm so ashamed. And yeah, going into a shul and just meeting a bunch of Jews who were like, oh, it's cool. Like, we actually have a pretty good system for taking care of yourself. It's like worked for thousands of years. And I was like, okay. And the big moment there were two big moments where it all really kind of crystallized. The first was I was at Coles, maybe 3 months sober, something like that. And I had been stealing groceries for so long that I wasn't even thinking about it anymore. It was second nature. I'd go in with a bag, I'd fill up a bag with everything, and then, check one thing out and leave. I just normalized this behavior because I believed that the capitalism and the theft is good, and the Coles, Woolies duopoly, just this whole system in my head, And I remember seeing this CCTV camera, and they'd been talking so much about finding a higher power, and I'd been looking at myself in this mirror and seeing myself from this kind of third party perspective, and I just saw this CCTV and was like whether or not I can justify it is irrelevant. But we see I know the results of what happens when I justify something. So let's offload onto something else. What would an objective, if there was a God, what would a God want me to do? Well, God would tell me not to steal all my groceries. So I took everything out of the bag and I checked it all in front of the people and I paid for it. And that was the moment where I was like, oh, wow, if you just do the right thing, then wait and see. The second moment was about a month later. I was walking my dog and I just got to the edge of a park, a really big park in Melbourne. And I felt like I woke up and I realized I'd walked across this whole park. It must have taken 15 minutes. And I hadn't been thinking about anything. The noise had just been turned off. I hadn't experienced this. I didn't know what this was, And all I had to do was get, sober and then basically stop stealing and obey the law and just wake up when you're supposed to wake up and go to sleep when you're supposed to go to sleep and engage in some spiritual practices. All of a sudden, just doing these tiny little things and the noise in my head completely went down and it went back up again very quickly. But I knew that that was all the evidence I needed. And as soon as I had that moment, I was like, that's it. That's it. I'm completely committed. I will do whatever I can. That's the best drug I've ever taken. And that's the big point. So everybody wants an answer of how did you change your politics or whatever? I believe that our politics are completely psychological. Everybody's trying to prove something to themselves. Everybody's trying to find something or run away from something. And my experience was that when I had the opportunity to actually meet myself and then meet the world around me and actually think about my interaction with it, that just completely started to change the way that I felt about the way that other people should act and the way that the world was supposed to be. I never really had a big moment of well, now I'm left wing or now I'm right wing or now I'm this or now I'm that. It just became a bit of a kind of, oh, now I understand why I was doing that stuff. And it kind of now just informs the way that I think about a lot of other things. It makes it impossible to be an anti-Zionist, right? Once you actually start to ask yourself, why do I think the way that I think? Why do I feel the way that I feel? It becomes very, very difficult.
So you basically just started to live your life normally, I guess. The light was regular, normal life. That was the light. Being able to just go about your life, not belonging to anything that had expectations of you. All you had to do was take care of yourself, be a moral person, walk your dog, and just live your life. That was
Yeah.
the light.
Yeah, it
And
was
then
all waiting for me. It was it was always there. I just always wanted to do things my way because I always had to prove a point to someone else. And yeah, I actually just gave up. That's the truth is that, I gave up. I just gave up on fighting in my late 20s. I just realized I actually can't beat the world and oh my, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm wrong?
yeah. And you sound like you were also so exhausted and you were at rock bottom.
I hope so.
Yeah. And now it's only onwards and upwards, hopefully.
I think so. I don't really, it's strange. I meet a lot of people. I still do a lot of I'm still involved in the, recovery world. I kind of keep it on the DL because of the stigma. I can only afford one stigma at a time. And
Terrible is that? Gosh, people are so judgy.
look, honestly, I think this might people have good reason. People have much better reasons to be judgmental of alcoholics and drug addicts, especially considering most don't make it out, and often it also is paired with serious mental health issues. So it's one of those things where I'm I go to AA now. I don't go to NA as much. I mentor younger men um, and I see the damage, and people are well within their rights to at
Depression.
least be very hesitant around that.
Yeah.
And So I kind of don't really talk about it that much anymore. It's not really worth it. But I also, at the same time, like, I feel like there are a lot of people out there who could really get help, but they don't really know that it's there,
Yeah.
or that they don't have experience with people who can offer hope.
Yeah.
And it's a very tricky space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you basically had your light. And then what made you turn from being an anti-Zionist to then what you would call a Zionist? And I know that you said that the water was anti-Zionism. So just the mere fact of you leaving the water already probably meant that you were no longer an anti-Zionist. But when did you personally start to learn about and educate yourself about Israel, and when did you decide, you know what, actually, I am a Zionist and Zionism is not a bad thing? Tell us about that specific journey.
So I think the original seed is with my mother. She heard me saying anti-Zionist things, growing up, and she was just like, "What are you talking about?" Like, my mum is a lefty Jew. Like, she's a proud lefty feminist Jew, and at and at no point was, like, Zionism bad, So when I would be anti-Zionist, my mum would be like, "I love you, but you're an idiot. You sound like an idiot." And that would make me very upset, but she was right. And she went to Israel, a fair few times. I guess I don't know how many times she's been. She has a relationship with the country. She's a very nuanced, very intelligent person. Um, and yeah, there I was being this, like, angry, arrogant little twerp, being like, through Israel, And so she just kind of, but the thing is, you can't, the good and the bad, you can't forget what your parents say to you,
Yeah.
Everything leaves an imprint. And so when I started, I guess, to acquaint myself with this idea that a lot of the basics, the values that either they had instilled or that were socially instilled, legally instilled, like, we all know theft is bad. We all know you shouldn't wake up and drink, right? And the same types of people giving me that sensible guidance, teachers, parents, people at shul, other people's parents, a lot of the time, wherever it was, like, they were also saying stuff like, "Why are you yelling about Israel? Like, you sound like an
Mm,
idiot." So
yeah.
it kind of fell out, the baby and the bathwater,
Yeah.
and then in my later 20s, when I started to get some clarity generally, there are a couple key things that happened. So the first was that I remember there was a bushfire season, and I was down at my grandma's house I was living in Melbourne at the time, but I'd driven up to New South Wales to stay with my grandma. And I remember, like, going into her bookshelf and noticing how Jewish it was. And it's so strange because I'd never really noticed before. And she's got just all of her books on this one huge, opera covering the wall. And I all of a sudden clocked that, like, what? Oh, like, this is so Jewish. And I had never really thought about how Jewish my grandma is. And then I'm thinking about kind of, okay, so what does she cook? Oh, okay, well, she just really cooks what she calls Hungarian peasant food, but actually, like, this is pretty Ashkenazi
Jewish.
stuff.
Yeah.
And then, um, what's strange, she seems to play a lot of, like, Eastern European music on her violin all the time, like, in her 90s. Wow, that's pretty Jewish. Oh, she became a doctor and met a bunch of other doctors who cared about being doctors and taking care of people, and it turned out a huge proportion of her friends are Jewish. She didn't choose to do that, it just happened. And now the bookshelf is so Jewish. And I picked out this book from the bookshelf, and it's this one I still keep on my desk,
Martin
because
Gil.
it is just the most basic. It's just maps and dates, And I remember picking this up, and I started at page 1 and thinking, maybe 27 years old, thinking, wait, this doesn't at all map with my perception of, like, the Nakba, for example, and,
Yeah.
historic Palestine. So I went to my grandmother's, like, incredibly old computer and started desperately Googling Martin Gilbert, thinking this has got to be, like, Israeli misinformation. This has got to be some type of Zionist, misinformation, propaganda. Oh, it turns out it's very, very reputable source,
Yeah.
I kept reading it and I just kind of went, wow, where did I get, I couldn't remember where all of the information I had that was contrary to it was. And so I started Googling all the things that I knew, and I couldn't find any evidence for any of the facts that I knew. And I just had this moment where I went, oh, this is really concerning. But this would have been maybe, 2017 or 2018, something like that. So then I just went back to the bookshelf and I spent a couple weeks there, and I just went through book after book after book, and was quite fascinated. I was mostly, because of having recently gotten sober, I was actually mostly thinking about myself, not about Israel. I was thinking, how did I invent this whole other other narrative of history when it's not true? Was I living in an alternate historical arc that isn't true? How did that happen? So I wasn't thinking about this as a Zionist or as a Jew or anything like that. I was thinking about it as a very reasonably self-centered person wondering, oh my God, what is wrong with me? How did this happen? Then I started dating a woman who had just spent a year living and working in Israel. And she'd done a lot of work, helping women escape honor killings or being pursued for honor killings. A lot of involvement in the outcomes of Arab women, and it was all funded and organized by the Israeli government, and that the programs that they had developed were now kind of being rolled out in other parts of the world. The Israeli government was investing huge amounts of time and resources in helping women escape domestic abuse, Arab, Palestinian, Arab, Israeli, however they identify women. And I just found I thought it was so interesting that I really had thought there's this horrible apartheid going on in Israel. But here's this person who is a really nice, trustworthy person explaining to me what her job was. And again, you can't not go and do some more research. And so I spoke to my mother. My mother was like, I tried to tell you, let me explain to you how the hospitals in the area are run. Let me explain to you how aid in the area works. And so, basically by the time I turned 30, I'd gone from being completely indoctrinated to being completely, deprogrammed.
And what does the term Zionism mean to you? How do you define Zionism?
I don't like personal definitions of Zionism. I like the basic. Zionism is not removing a state. It's, I feel like, for me, this is personal. I don't outwardly, loudly proclaim that I'm a Zionist, but that's not because I don't think it's something to be proud of. It's the opposite. I am so disgusted with the idea that that is not the default position. That word even continues to have to be something that people like myself would feel like I have to say is actually a testament to the anti-Zionist movement. So my personal perspective is that no one has to say I'm a Pakistanist, because there is no anti-Pakistanist movement, right? The state was created 10 months earlier than Israel for a religious minority carved out of British India. It's very analogous to the creation of Israel, but there's no anti-Pakistanist movement. So there's no Pakistanist movement. They're just Pakistani. And I don't have to identify as an abolitionist, right? Abolition is done, right? It's done. I don't have to, but there is no anti-abolitionist movement. So it doesn't have to be part of who I am. So I am so fundamentally sure and clear about the mere existence of the state of Israel that, for me, Zionism is something that I feel like if I was to outwardly say, yes, I'm a Zionist among non-Jews, I'm actually making it seem as though that's different to normal, where really it should be, wait, you're anti-Zionist? Why would you be anti the existence of the state? However, that being personal, if I had been raised in a more Jewish home with a formal relationship with Israel, I think my relationship to the word Zionism would be different. So instead, I'm kind of parasitic, because there are a lot of Jews whose identities are very like outwardly Zionist, and I get a lot from them. Like I don't have, it's maybe parasitic and unfair because I don't have to be a flag waving Zionist because they are, you know, and they don't have to be flag waving campaigning against anti-Zionism because I am, right? And we operate in an ecosystem. And the one thing that we all agree on that I do not get to define, and neither do they, but is basic reality, common decency, is that you cannot stigmatize a state using ancient libels and conspiracies and modern libels and conspiracies to the extent that you make it seem reasonable to delete it and push it into the sea. So I think there is nothing I take more for granted than Zionism. You know, it just, at least in this conversation, it is absolutely an unquestionable facet of what should be a reasonable, normal person's conception of reality.
Understand why you don't want to call yourself a Zionist, and
But
how
I
that.
do. I am, like, for the
No,
record, like,
but
I am
yeah,
100% a Zionist.
I was going to say there's like many ultra Orthodox Jews, for instance, who say, I'm not a Zionist because for them, Zionism is equals secularism or a substitution for Judaism. Or basically, they have all the ideas of the Messiah and that the state of Israel halted the Messiah. But really, intrinsically, being a Jew is a Zionist. Zion, v'techazena enenu b'shivcha l'tzion barachamim. This is what we say in the Amidah prayer 3 times a day, that we should be able to return to Zion. And the concept of the Jewish homeland, Eretz HaKadosh, Eretz Israel, is an intrinsic part of just being a Jew. Like, it's foundational to Judaism. So if you're an Orthodox practicing Jew, whether you want to call yourself whatever, you're actually a Zionist. You believe in the land of Israel, in the holiness of Israel, and you believe that the Jewish people have a right to live in their homeland. Now, you might not believe in perhaps autonomy, maybe, because if you don't believe in the secular state and the Messiah, that's like very extreme and very few. But most Jewish people believe that the Jewish people have a right to live in their ancestral homeland, perhaps in part, not in whole, but some people whole, and that we have a right to have autonomy over ourselves, that we can lead and rule ourselves. I think 95% of Jews are actually Zionists, even if they don't want to call themselves a Zionist. For me, my approach is, and I'm actually Chabad, and it's tricky because Chabad don't like to call themselves Zionists. And that's another whole conversation. And it bothers me. And I also feel like if the haters are going to call us Zionists, then I deliberately want to call myself a Zionist as well. And maybe that's me allowing the haters to define who I am in some respects. But I'm like, if they're going to call me a Zionist, then hell yeah, I'm a Zionist and I'm owning that. And I also genuinely believe in it as well. But it's tricky.
Yeah, I actually just think most people don't even consider the relationship between Zion and Zionism. That seems to be lost on most people. And like even among Jews, it doesn't actually really seem to get just like, I don't know. I just feel like it's the default position. And I actually I hate talking about it because it feels so, it's like if someone over and over again for years and years and years was like, so what does a bird mean to you? Like, explain bird. Like, explain some concept. Like, explain tree. Like, what is, tree to you? And like, it's actually like, of course, tree is complicated. There's heaps of different ways of tree, and there's heaps of different ways of bird, and there's heaps of different ways of Zionism. But fundamentally, they all hold their own, in essence, completely particular and permanent structure. A bird probably has wings and a beak, right? Tree probably has bark and leaves, right? And a Zionism probably has Jews in it.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, I hear you. I really do hear you. So, as you're healing and going through your journey, how did you get into your activism? And I also want to know what impact October the 7th had on you personally. Like, was that also kind of a bit of a turning point as well? Or perhaps not? Share with us.
Yeah, well, I think I've always been a bit of an activist. My partner calls me a revolutionary, I think in part to make fun of me, but also because I've been on such a journey with it. Like, when I was a kid or, in my late teens, early 20s, I didn't know that's what I was doing. I didn't know that I was kind of tilting at windmills, and, I was proud to be like a revolutionary, but I didn't really think much more about it until my, mid to late 20s, when I really crashed out and had to rebuild and really consciously decided to stop fighting, like there's a key like few words in the Alcoholics Anonymous like big book where it just says we ceased fighting, and I read that and was like, I need to stop, and I'd been writing for different like publications and stuff for a long time, and considered myself a writer, and I just stopped, and I stopped producing, bar the odd article here and there. I just stopped doing that and got completely into physical labor and just was a laborer for years, while I kind of rebuilt everything and slowly started to write again. But yeah, there's a long period of time where I couldn't really involve myself in it. It just felt too emotional, and I was also very scared of doing anything that, that actually like had a emotional effect on me. Like I was really just trying to take care of myself and be, but after a few years, I was just writing more, and I guess I went back to uni and did a degree in writing at RMIT, and a couple of things happened. Like, firstly, I think it was 2021. There was this just a really dumb, probably not evil, but just really dumb guy in my course who was talking about making sure Jews leave Israel because, they're from Europe. And it was really strange that it was coming in response to what was happening at the Al-Aqsa Mosque at the time. There'd been civil unrest, and a bunch of like disinformation had come out. And I was sitting there going, how is this person in Australia all of a sudden saying that Jews should be leaving Israel because they're from Europe? Like, I couldn't work it out. And I'm doing this writing degree. I'm listening to anti-Zionism on campus. I'm feeling ostracized for simply saying, that is insane. What are you talking about? And yeah, I guess I just started writing more and more. And I'm not very, like, I don't have very many skills, but I do have a skill set that I am that I can't do much about, but I'm good at talking, and I'm good at writing. I'm good at communicating. And I felt like I'd spent so much time on the far left, but was now spending time with more conservatives as well. Spent so much time with atheist Jews, left-wing Jews, now right-wing Jews, centrist Jews. I was spending so much time with like all of these different groups of people and noticing the ways in which they all need to be handled with different shades of white gloves. And so I thought, I want to know how many different newspapers I can get published in. And I thought about it for a long time. Like, what's it going to take to get published in like the whole political spectrum? I thought about it, but it wasn't until October 7 that I really felt like I needed to. I was like, every single person in this country who reads any type of media has to understand what I'm on about, and I need to find a way to reach them. And so I did. I have been published in that period by every single major news outlet in Australia, bar The Guardian, from SBS, ABC, AFR, The Australian, Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, like all of them. That was my mission. And after I worked out I could do it, I felt like I wasn't able to be fully myself in these pieces. Everything had to be tailored specifically to the publication. And often publications, they don't understand Jews, even when they think they're helping to advocate for Jews by publishing a Jew. So I would write about a particular experience or something Jewish, and they would like push back on it, or not understand. They didn't have any kind of the cultural sensitivity that they apply to all other people. Just wasn't really being applied at all. And it was taking so much time and effort to explain basic concepts to the highest kind of paid, most experienced editors in the country. I was quite shocked. And even in the immediate aftermath of Bondi, like the amount of hours spent trying to get basic pieces published in basic newspapers, like apolitical, right? Like no mention of Israel or anything like that. and they just didn't understand. And it's like, I felt like they've had 2 years to get with the program. We would think that those who we presume to be our allies, ideologically, would understand what we are. And I realized they didn't. They'd continue to publish what they needed to publish to stamp, to stamp that they're I guess, like, to get a rubber stamp, to, what's the word? Like,
They got
they
that coach's certificate. Boom, we
yeah, they did,
we
but they
publish an
didn't
article.
get it. They didn't get it. And I realized last year that the big thing that no one was understanding was anti-Zionism. And that the moment people understand what anti-Zionism is, everything else can be dealt with. But until someone understands what anti-Zionism is, nothing can be done. You cannot address any form of anti-Jewish vilification or violence in this country if you don't understand anti-Zionism. You cannot protect your children if you don't understand anti-Zionism, and your children cannot protect themselves if they don't understand anti-Zionism. And once that hit me, I just ran with it, and I became a I don't know what the word is, heavily involved in the movement against anti-Zionism, and started up the Australian chapter of the movement against anti-Zionism. And within a 6-month period, we have trained a couple thousand people in Australia, with trainings rolling out across our biggest Jewish organizations. We've also done trainings at various high schools and a number of other spaces. I'll be in Melbourne doing trainings from next week for about a week. And we've also had a huge hand in the Royal Commission. A lot of people more people than I've been able to respond to. And I lost count of the number of people who've emailed us showing us how their training has helped them, in their Royal Commission submission. So, we've run on a budget of about, I think, $1,500 to $2,000 in 6 months. That's the entire project has cost about that much. Obviously self-funded. And yeah, I mean, if you're sitting there meeting with Alex Rivchin one week, and then like tomorrow training JBOD and the JCAJ and some staff at AJAC, like, we must be doing something right,
100%. All I had to do was attend a little mini 45-minute session of yours, and I was like, this guy Josh is next level, and boy, do we need to spread what you teach and understanding the new reality that we're living in order to navigate it appropriately. You had a whole journey. What advice would you give people who perhaps their family members are anti-Zionist Jews, or maybe they're not pro-Israel, or how do you navigate and deal with Jewish people who you love and you care about, but they're just not understanding the actual reality of what's going on?
Honestly, there has been no answer to that question. There have been answers that haven't worked to that question. So I can go through the long list of things that not only don't work but make things worse. Like telling them all about Israel, or explaining Zionism, or any of these things. Like, it actually doesn't work, and it makes things worse because it elevates their bigotry into what starts to feel like criticism. The reason that I jumped on and became so involved with movement against anti-Zionism, it's the only thing I've seen work. Now, like, not only do I gain nothing from promoting anti-Zionism, not only do I gain nothing from promoting the movement against anti-Zionism, but it costs me significantly. It costs me a tremendous amount of sleep. I have no free time. I'm completely unpaid. It's terribly affecting my actual job. I have a job that I'm supposed to be doing. So when I say this, don't interpret this as like some type of like selfish spruiking. Like, literally, all I would say is check out the movement against anti-Zionism, right? Because the first step is not to send these people off to some training. The first step is to do it yourself. Most people who are trying to interact with anti-Zionists or trying to speak to a loved one don't actually understand what they're dealing with. And almost all of them are so sure that they do, that they never come to a training, and then they can't work out why it's so uncomfortable trying to work out whether or not that problematic son or daughter should be at Shabbat, right? But like
Yeah.
really, you need to educate yourself first and foremost on what this is and how it operates. Get to a MAAZ training, honestly. If I don't have anything else for you, maybe if I wanted to be more cryptic, I would say like be patient, but not too patient. But really, yeah, we have to understand, like if you were to ask me, like, let's say someone had someone in their life that was dying of cancer, what would you tell to them? I would say, well, go and like understand what that is. Like, what is dying of cancer? Like, how does that happen? And what can be done about it? And what does it really mean? And you want to really understand the problem. You don't go talk at the person about dying of cancer as though you can like explain cancer to them better and make it easier. You need to understand this thing, and then you'll be able to engage with them.
Yeah, and give them love, I reckon. Lots of love. Or not. Or
I don't know.
maybe.
It depends on the person. I don't know.
Wow, Josh, thank you so much for your time. We're going to put all the information about MAAZ in the show notes, as well as a link for people to be able to donate. But guys, really check out MAAZ. And we're very lucky that in Melbourne, MAAZ is Please God coming July to run a few sessions, and in Sydney. So everyone who follows the Empowered Jew will stay tuned. But really, Josh, thank you for everything. Thank you for what you're doing for the community, for the Jewish people collectively. And thank you for being so vulnerable and sharing with us your story. I know that lots of people are going to be deeply inspired. And, who knows what positive change and impact this conversation will have. We'll have to stay tuned. But really, thank you so, so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.